Hello, welcome to a new episode of Django Chat. Today we're going to talk about what is Django. I'm Will Vincent and joined by Carlton Gibson.
Hello.
And this is an episode that we've wanted to do for a long time because we both work with Django professionally, but also in a teaching capacity where we're dealing with people who are new to programming or new to web development or just new to Django. There's a lot of different ways to explain what Django actually is. So we're going to dive into that today. So Carlton, when someone asks you, what is Django? What do you say?
Right. Good question. Right. So Django is, the web framework, right? So what's a web framework? What's a web request? What's the web? The web is your browser is talking to, you type in a URL, it sends off a request to a server. That server compiles a response in the form of an HTML page and sends it back to you. That's the fundamental task. There are various bits of that which are the same every single time. And so you don't want to build those from scratch every single time. So a web framework is a tool which gives you the basic building blocks, enabling you to build your web application that serves those responses. So there's a view layer, there's a template layer, there's an ORM. These are bits of the Django that you don't want to create from scratch.
Right, because it's because it's, well, I was going to say boring. It's not boring, but it's the same. Every site has, 90% of the functionality is the same. It needs to talk to a database. It needs to handle requests, so load this page. And because it's so much of it is the same, it makes sense that web frameworks emerge. Basically, there's one or two big ones for every programming language. So Ruby has Ruby on Rails, JavaScript has Express, PHP has Laravel, Python has Flask and Django. And I guess within that, there's different philosophies of how you build a web framework. But yeah, I usually describe it as it's a set of tools to make it faster so you can focus on what's different about a website, not what's the same. Yeah,
perfect. The tagline is the web framework for perfectionists with a deadline. So the idea is you want to do it right, but you've got to do it quickly.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the challenge of this question is, I always ask someone, where are you at? Like, what level are you at? So if I explain to my mom what a web framework is, my mom is not technical. I just say, it's a tool that makes it easier to build websites. And that's kind of as much as she wants to know, right? And then if it's somebody learning programming, it's like, well, let's talk about what a website is, which, as you said, you need to learn about HTTP, where you do request and response. So you load a page each time. And you can kind of break down the functionality and you want, there's a lot of things you can get wrong. There's a lot of security things. And so it makes sense to have a community of millions of people over, in Django's case, what is it, 14 years, something like that.
Yeah.
To, it's not the kind of work you want to do on your own. And I always think of it as nobody cares what web framework you use.
No,
I mean, engineers
they do care if your site's insecure, or they do care if it's slow, or they do care if it's, non-functional.
Yeah, exactly. So it's purely, sort of a tool for us developers, but a tool that's awesome and important. And you'd be, as a learning exercise, it would be interesting to build your own web framework, but you would quickly, I think, appreciate why. It's sort of crazy that anyone starts one.
It is these days. Like kind of in the early 2000s, everybody wrote their own web framework. They picked up Perl, they wrote their web framework in Perl. They picked up PHP, they wrote their own web. And you had all these homebrew web frameworks around. And they all had problems. And, the community ones arose from that kind of Armageddon of homebrew frameworks.
Right. Well, it's a little bit like the curse of the engineer where I love the example of, I should blog. Okay, let me write a blog. Sit down, stare at the blank page. I should use a static site generator. Let me go check out Jekyll or Gatsby and then look at it and go, it's not quite what I want. I'm just going to build my own. But, it's sort of like you're not an engineer unless you've gone ahead and build your own. And then, weeks later, you still haven't written that blog post and you're like, this is kind of actually harder than I thought. Maybe I'll just use
but it's in a way it's easier to write a static site generator than it is to read the docs of a static site generator and work out how it works.
Yes, true. Right. So Django's a web framework. It's a set of tools to automate what you use to build a website. There are a lot of, I always say, again, as I mentioned, I start with, so there's programming languages. That's the base layer. There's a couple popular ones, Python, Ruby, JavaScript, PHP. Would be the big ones. And then within that, there's one or two web frameworks. So you sort of have to go up the ladder in terms of choosing your tools, I think within the web frameworks, there's sort of, if you can make a distinction, there's micro frameworks like Flask, where you have lots of, it's like a manual car. Or you have ones like Django, which are full-bodied, batteries included. It's more like an automatic. So do you lose a little bit of control? Yes, but you don't, that's not even, it's more, David Hennemeyer Hansen of Ruby on Rails described it as the difference between a bag of Legos you dump on the floor, that's a micro framework, and a truck that just works. So we'll probably do a separate episode on that. But, there's choices one has to make. And as working with a web framework, that web framework's architects made choices around, how much control to give you, but also how much, rope for you to hang yourself with.
Yeah, and I think the bigger example here is in the JavaScript community, in the Node.js community, where they use these really small micro components and then they have to bolt them together. And there's an art in knowing which the packages are and which one relies on which and which works well together and which are maintained, and putting together your package, which then, you've got maximum control, but there's quite a lot of work in that. And with Django and Rails in particular, they go for the batteries included approach, so they provide you not everything you need, but all the main components all in one. You install Django, you know that most of what you need is there, and then you might reach out to the third-party packages in the community for those few bits that aren't.
Right. Whereas with a micro framework, from the beginning, you're going to have to install dozen third-party packages just for a basic blog site.
Yeah.
Because it's just not included. So different philosophies.
There's nothing wrong with that, depending on your application. But
we're clearly biased, but many people are biased as we are. And it depends on what you need. It depends on the context.
My personal experience, I've used all of these frameworks over the years, and my personal experience is that I'm much more productive with Django, simply because it's all there and I don't have to go search it. This time spent looking for other packages, it's not time well spent. I can be writing my application. And for me, I can get right down to the view layer and I know it well. So it's not like I have more freedom with a micro framework.
Right. You can change things in Django if you want to, but you don't have to.
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, I'm much more efficient doing it that way. Flask might be a little bit more lightweight or whatever, but I have to go and look at the docs and try and remember what the interface is. Whereas with Django, I know that, I recognize it. And so it's much quicker for me to produce something in Django than it is in another framework.
Yeah, and there's we'll link in the notes. There's a fantastic PyCon talk from 2017 by Jacob Kaplan-Moss called "Let's Build a Web Framework," where he goes through basically the ingredients and the choices that you have to make in a web framework. And, so that's 3 hours long, but worth looking at if you really want to think about these things. And it helps, it helps your appreciation, helps you understand the choices Django makes, because not every choice is perfect, but most of them are good. And the ones that aren't perfect can be worked on. So, so let's move on. So why... Yeah, I think we've covered. The next thing, is why would you recommend Django to someone? Usually the argument, someone says, I want to build a website. And usually I try to ask, well, what exactly do you want? If you're, Django is a good choice for many people because it's built with Python, which if you're learning programming these days, Python and JavaScript are the two most popular languages. Python probably more in the academic context. If you have a CS degree, more and more of that education is in Python.
Yeah, and in the business context as well.
Yes.
With the whole data science and data analysis and Jupyter notebooks. And I know that you can use JavaScript in Jupyter notebooks, but it's Python based and the whole Pandas project and all of that.
Yeah.
Python is very practical in the real world.
Right. Yeah.
And then Django is probably the go-to web framework in that environment. I know there's Flask as well, but for people in the real economy, to reach for Django is a much more sensible choice, I think, than to reach for Flask, because they don't, exactly as we were just talking about, they don't know the ins and outs of the Flask ecosystem.
I think, when you start out, the hello world with Flask is simpler than Django. So I think sometimes I see people think that Flask is better for beginners, but often I would argue that once you do anything more than hello world, Django has got your back. And most of the people I see using Flask are quite advanced developers with very specific use cases.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially around microservices. So in some ways, I think, Flask is at sort of either end of the spectrum and Django is more in the middle. And again, you should learn both, but Django is a great choice, someone who wants to learn web development. But part of the challenge, and I talked to a lot of people about this, is just the first time you learn web development, there's so much to learn. And Django and Rails sort of have a degree of magic in that they solve things for you. And so you sort of back your way into learning how this all works. But I personally think that's the way to do it. There's no sense in reading a 1,000-page manual before you start a website. Like, build something and then iterate on it. And when you want to customize it, that's a good chance to learn more about, what is the view layer? How do templates really work? Routing. I personally, I like the ability to just get something done and then backfill rather than have to spend huge amounts of time up front.
I think people aren't, most learners aren't in a position where they want to learn everything from the first principles and then build up. They want to get something functional up and running and play with it and then tweak it and learn.
Right,
so you
right.
can, the great thing with like the Django tutorials or whatever is you can get a blog site up and running, which you've built, and it's a functioning blog site and it's great. And you've got forms and you can edit and you can, users can filter by tags and all these great stuff. And you haven't really understood all of it, but you've got this functional thing that works and it's yours and you built it, and then you can grow it and play with it and learn more.
Yeah. So in the same way that, Python is, a good beginner language choice, but also used at the highest levels. Django as well kind of can span that spectrum for you. So what else should we say? I mean, there's so much, we have an entire podcast on Django, so there's so many areas we could dive into about, what Django does, databases, views, URLs, templates. I guess another, in terms of, what is Django? Why is Django special? It was built from the beginning with this, for perfectionists on a deadline, this idea of you should be able to work quickly on things. And part of that is some of the maybe extra features that not every web framework has. So the admin is a huge one.
So this is right, the admin. So it was built for a newspaper company, right? And they had 2 or 3 publications, and they had the development team who were building the web, the online publications, but they had the content authors who needed to be able to come in and write newspaper articles and enter them into the database. And so the Django admin was born in this environment. And what that gives you is an instant admin interface on top. So you define some models, which are part of the ORM, which we haven't really talked about. But on top of that, the admin just then creates this whole interface, which enables you to edit, add, it's got permissions involved with it. It's super. And to get that out of the box for essentially zero effort is one of Django's key features, I think. It's one of the things that historically has been a drawing point.
It's quite special. And I think, at all levels, to have a graphical interface way to interact with the guts is very powerful. So you can also go into the Django Shell. So that's like a command line view, which some people prefer. But, even for me, sometimes it's nice to just see my stuff instead of having to live in the command line. And certainly for beginners, when I teach total beginners, I don't drop into the Django Shell at all. There is this admin there. So once you set up your basic things, you can go in and, add blog posts. You can add comments, you can add users. You can do this in a very visual way that I think is, great for teaching.
Yeah, and as well, like, it doesn't matter how advanced you are. It's almost, I can't think of a single case where it wouldn't be worth just doing the 4 lines of code to create the admin for your model.
Yeah. You always want some sort of admin view. And then especially, as you said, with the permissions built in, more and more everyone in a company, even non-technical people, need a way to look at the, business people, marketing, sales, to look at the data. And there's lots of, Django comes with that out of the box, which is a super strong feature. Another, I'd say, what's the top list of things that makes Django special? Forms. So forms, search bar, entering user input. That's the core of almost every website. Django really handles that in an elegant way, I would say, in terms of you can get up and running quickly, but you also can customize it, and all the security stuff. The security stuff is very well handled.
Well, like the input
strengths of
validation, and
there's so many ways you can make a mistake, especially when you're learning. But even as a pro, there's just so many things that Django, and we should mention among your other projects. You are now maintain Django Crispy Forums, which is an add-on to.
Yeah, so that's good. Like, I don't know, you might want to have, say you've got a model field which isn't part of the form. It enables you to create a nice form layout, so you've got like the form fields that you want editable, and then a few model fields, and then some more form fields. It's kind of cool for defining model fields or form layouts, which are non-standard. It makes that into a nice programmatic interface. So it's a good package.
Yeah, and that's I guess the next point, that's an example of a third-party package, of which there are many with Django. Yeah. So Django sort of gives you a lot, batteries included, but then there is a very robust ecosystem of these third-party packages where you can, enhance or customize a built-in feature, or you can have additional functionality that isn't in Django itself because it's, doesn't need to be, or there's a lot to maintain with Django as is. But there's a Django packages website we'll link to that.
Yeah, and we should do a show on our favorite packages, I think.
Yeah.
They say like third-party packages are Django's secret sauce, and for almost anything you can think of, there's a third-party package out that implements it, and either it's well maintained and feature complete, in which case just use it, or it's at least a prototype that you can copy and base your own code off, depending on the state of completeness of a third-party package. But yeah, the richness of Django's ecosystem, especially after all this time, is something irreplaceable, I think.
Yeah, and that's something that I think with experience, Django's not a shiny new toy anymore, but it's still being actively worked on and improved. And that's really valuable when you're actually have some experience and get burned by, early stage frameworks change a lot.
Yeah.
And you have to ask yourself, do you want to have a website or build a company and to have some stability there, or do you want to just play around? And so, I've been burned. I think a lot of people over the course of their career have been burned by new frameworks that change a lot because they have to. But, Django is very mature and yet under active development.
Yeah, and it's so good in that respect, in that you can be on the latest version quite easily without any problems because it is stable, it is secure, it is mature. And that means that you don't have to worry that the new version has broken your entire site and that you're going to have to restructure everything, and then you're going to end up on an unsupported version. That we're on version nearly 2.2. We're going to be on version 3 this year. Those big numbers, they mean something. It's not 0. something, right?
Right. And yeah, I mean, that's something that, like all good advice, if you haven't experienced this yet, this probably isn't clicking for you, but if you have, it really does. So trust us, it's a positive to have a mature framework.
I think it makes it. I think it makes it really exciting. It means that you can be right on the edge. You can get all the new features, all the bug fixes, without having to worry about your site falling over because something changed that you were relying on.
Right, and again, this is another trap for engineers: is how much do you want to work on the plumbing versus the special sauce. And, it's good to do both. And certainly there are things about the plumbing that are really interesting and challenging. But, for most people, I think you want to focus on something that differentiates it in some way. And so using a tool like Django, which can be customized, which can be improved, is the way to spend your time rather than, if you want to write a web framework from scratch, go for it. But don't kid yourself. You can start a company and build a web framework from scratch.
Yeah.
That's not going to work.
You've got to be somewhat conservative in your technology choices, right? If you're always on the latest database, always on the latest web framework, always on the latest front-end framework, you're never going to get anything built.
Right. But yeah, you need to stay current. And we'll do a separate episode on Django versions and talk about how, the Django roadmap for changes. But it is advancing and also well thought out. So, if you're using Django, you can stay up to date. What else? Testing. So this is one, looking at you, JavaScript, that Django has its own tests and also takes advantage of Python's built-in tests. And tests are fantastic to use in Django. And this is another one where, with experience, you go, how can I not have something with robust testing? And yet not every web framework does.
Well, there's two parts to it. One is the web framework itself well tested, and Django is. And the other is, does it provide tools that enable you to write tests for your own code easily? And Django does. So there's those two aspects of it. Both are important.
Yeah. And there's, sort of, I guess the last big thing I would say is when Django is called the user model. So every web framework is going to have some way for users to sign up, to log in. And there are different choices a framework can make around that. Django gives you built-in options, but it's also very customizable. And I think, that's a good choice that it makes, but that's sort of the last major component of any web framework, because you need to have some sort of user registration. And, there's things like social authentication, two-factor. We could do a whole episode on that, but Django gives you something to get up and running. And then there are third-party packages and built-in ways that you can kind of make your choice, because there isn't one user authentication technique that works for everyone at this point.
No, what do you want? Do you want to be people to be able to create user accounts or give them user accounts, and then you want them to be able to log in, and then them to be able to create blog posts of their own or articles of their own, or whatever your content is? And have that
and you can
set all their user, and then you want to restrict access just to their ones, not to everybody's. And Django gives you the basic building blocks for all of that. And then, there's, if you want Facebook login, there's third-party apps for that. And if you want two-factor auth, there's third-party for that. This is where the ecosystem is great. There's the foundation, and then the surrounding things which add on all the extras. It would be impossible. It would make, to include every single thing in the core is just make it a maintenance impossibility.
Right. And that's because that is a good beginner question of, well, why have third-party packages? Why not have everything in there? And it's just too much to manage, too many maintainers, and
and too much complication. There comes batteries included is all very well, but kitchen sink included. Well, there comes a point where if it's not suitable for your project, why do you need it? And this is on that continuum again between micro frameworks and more full-featured frameworks. And hopefully Django hits something of a sweet spot in that it's batteries including, it's got the core, and then with the ecosystem as well, it's got all the other things you want, and it's extensible too.
So when I sort of tell people, what is Django and why should you use Django, the big points I sort of hit is, look, it's really popular. It's been around for a while. It's used by some of the biggest websites in the world. Like Instagram is probably the most prominent example.
Yeah, Pinterest, I think.
Discuss.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think Pinterest maybe moved off. When you get to a certain size, everything kind of gets custom.
Yeah.
But, a huge one is it's built in Python, which Python is a great choice for learning how to program. And so if you're new to programming and you want to build a website, Django is a great choice for you. You should always, just like you should learn multiple programming languages, you should learn multiple web frameworks. But if you have to pick one starting out, I think Django is a great choice. And again, it's just like the Python programming language, it's scalable. You can get up and going, but you can also use it on the biggest sites in the world. And that's not a common feat for many technologies that they can span that spectum.
Yeah, it's something like that. It's certainly, the story for beginners is certainly compelling, but also the story to keep going with it. Why haven't I abandoned it for something else? Yeah, over the years I've used multiple frameworks in multiple languages, and why do I stick with Django? Because ultimately, when I come to write a website, it's got all the tools I need.
Yeah, and we haven't even touched upon, API support, which, Django is extremely strong with. And in some ways, that's probably what more, intermediate, advanced level people come to Django, come to Django for if they haven't already used it, is they say, right, I need to build a RESTful API, look around, and, with Django REST framework, you get a very Django-like approach, which is not common with many API frameworks.
Yes, and then so you spend a few years writing APIs using Django REST framework, and then you come back and you think, actually, the rest of Django is exactly what I need for building the rest of the site around it.
Yeah. I'd be curious how many people, what the progression is if people, jump into Django REST framework. I mean, I think APIs are a next stage after you built websites in some fashion, but to have,
if I had to guess on that, I would say that people build some basic websites using, say, Django just as when they're learning, and then they find themselves in a professional situation where they're writing an actual application, and they're immediately writing APIs.
Yeah, that's the thing, that when people are learning, most Django developers in a professional context, as you say, are probably writing APIs, and yet, if you were going to build a full stack so dedicated back-end, front-end application as a solo, engineer, that's quite a challenge. It doesn't make quite as much sense, but in any company setting, you're going to be focusing and very specific in your what you're doing day to day anyways.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between a side project that you're writing by yourself and then something you're doing in a bigger company. If you're working on Django in a bigger company, almost certainly you're using REST framework, and then they've got front end engineers which are using React or Vue or whatever this week's hotness is.
Yeah. But that is that, when people are learning, it's like, okay, I want to learn how to program. All right, we'll learn how to build static sites with HTML and CSS, and now sprinkle in JavaScript, and now learn about, databases and user authentication and security.
And on the way, learn Bash and...
Yeah. Command line, right. Yeah. And then, okay, great. I'll use Django, because I have this people read my books and like, yay. And they're like, wait, what's the APIs? It's like, oh yeah, well, actually, you're probably writing APIs with it. And then they write that and they're like, oh, great. And it's like, oh, well, now I need to learn a front end framework. So there is a degree to which you sort of go, oh my God. But you do, I think, you can, with practice, you can remove yourself and say, right, these are how the pieces fit together. And you can't master them all, but you can play around with them. In a professional setting, you'll generally focus a bit your skills. And, to plug Django again, Django is kind of there for you all the way through. And if you've used Django and then you switch to something else, you're going to be spoiled.
I mean, again,
unless it's Rails, which has a different, similar idea, you're used to batteries included but customizable, and then you have to just do all the guts yourself. It just takes so much time.
And and as well, I think the other way of looking at it is in the context of the wider technology, where there's front end frameworks, there's DevOps stuff, there's databases, there's search engines, there's all these tools. Django, by focusing on Django, which makes a lot of the decisions for you, you keep the surface area of what you need to know for that component, that back end web application component, as smaller than it would otherwise be.
Yeah, the actual code that you were writing is very, very concise.
And the things you have to know,
readable.
Like you don't have to know all the surrounding ecosystem packages. You don't have to know all these details because Django's made those decisions for you.
Yeah, right. That's why I think most micro frameworks are much more suitable to advanced users rather than someone intermediate level.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, for beginner, advanced beginner, even competent people, I wouldn't recommend micro frameworks because I think you're making the job too hard for yourself. Sure, when you're an expert, you do what you want.
Yeah, well, and like all good advice, I mean, what I find is I tell people that they sometimes don't listen, they go off and then they get stuck with a micro framework and then come back and say, oh, you were right.
Yeah, but that's learning too. That's part of learning. Yeah. That's fine. So that's part of the life experience.
Yeah. If you're with a micro framework and you're feeling really stuck and confused by all the third-party packages, try something like Django and see how that goes for you.
Yeah, and like whenever you try anything, you have to give it time. There's no I tried Flask for a day and didn't like it. I tried Django for a day. Things take longer than that. So you have to give everything its due.
Deep thoughts.
Well,
All right. So anything else we want to mention before we wrap up?
No,
Well, there's, this is one of the early episodes. There's so many more areas we're going to talk about. So if you have feedback, please let us know. You can go to our website, djangochat.com. And if there are topics you want us to discuss, you can suggest them. We have a lot of things we're going to talk about, but let us know.
Yeah. Ping us on Twitter at chatdjango.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.